This is the first of a two-part video showing how to adjust valve lash with replaceable shims in a 1995 Kawasaki Vulcan. In this first episode, we'll disassemble the bike to get at the top of the engine, we'll swap plugs and drain coolant, and we'll discuss functional design features of the cooling system and the controversial air suction pollution control system. Okay, it seems like an irony that I'm going to start the job here. To do valve clearance, you need to drain some coolant. And Kawasaki asks that coolant be drained every couple of years, and so we're going to drain all of the coolant from this drain bolt right here. Now, just for reference, the front of the bike is that way. We're looking at it from the right side of the bike, and this is the oil drain plug. And this is the 10mm coolant drain plug that I'm going to loosen off in a moment. Now, while I've got you here, this is the weep hole. And a weep hole is designed to be an early warning system if the seal for the water pump is leaking, and if it's leaking you need to change it right away before you destroy some of the internal bearings and architecture of the water pump. And so have a look here, look for any green crusting. You won't necessarily see any fluid dripping unless the engine is running. And you just need to take this one here, it's 8mm. Now I need to get this instrument cover off. You just lift it up. Be careful of the gasket. And then there's a speedo cable and two connectors. We've got to undo those now. The speedo cable, you just turn it this way, and that's coming undone nicely. You may need to put a wrench on it. I've had this off a few times. Now when I loosen this cap, coolant is going to drain out of the hole that I opened in the bottom. Do you hear that? Now get in the habit of whenever you're looking at a radiator cap, look at the two gates here. Look at the seals, make sure there's no evidence of breakdown or dry rot of the seals. And you can see the big spring in the bottom. There are two one-way gates and they point in opposite directions. Now to inspect the smaller gate, look at this here. I don't know if you can see this. You see I'm just prying that up there? That little gate needs to open when pressure becomes negative, so you want to make sure it's not stuck down. See that? It's got to be able to lift off. Make sure it's not stuck down because that's the key to the burping process when these things refill themselves. Okay, there's one more bolt holding the tank on. It's right here. It's 12mm. Okay, one of the points of anxiety when neophytes take a tank off for the first time is the question as to how do I prevent the fuel from spilling out when I undo this little pinch connector. And this is an automatic petcock, and if you see there's no off position. It's either on, pry for prime, or reserve. And you want the arrow, which is right here, pointed at either on or reserve. And in that case, if the petcock is working properly, it won't leak out of this valve. Now is a good time to find it if it is going to leak. So make sure you're not smoking, make sure there's nothing going on, but we're going to undo this pinch valve here and we'll see if our petcock is working properly. Okay, now if it does leak here, you need to work on your petcock, and I actually did a video on that because mine was leaking a while ago, but it seems to be okay now. So at this point we need to disconnect the vent tube and lift this thing out. Now the vent tube just dangles down from the bottom of the tank. So let's see if I can move it. There's our vent tube there. Now, just so you don't lose them, you got to know about these two grommets here, one on either side. And you could easily lose these if you didn't know they were there. The tank rests down on them, and so I'm going to take them off just for safekeeping. Now let's take off the air filter and the air filter housing. I always put the date as when I last changed this, April 2020. Now these two bolts, these also are 10mm. Now let's take off the surge tank. I find that an interesting description. These two bolts are 10mm. Now it just routes air into the air filter housing. And in a car they'd call this the resonator. I don't know why they call it a surge tank. In any case, it's a surge for air, and it just fits in like so. Okay, let me show you this here. If you look down this hole right here, you actually see the tip of the thermostat. And when the engine is cooling overnight, after you've ridden it hard for the previous day, when it's cooling, negative pressure is created in the system and it draws fluid up this little tube which goes to the reservoir. And what that requires is that little valve that I showed you to open. Now, when the engine is warming up, the thermostat is closed and no coolant can go along this pipe. There's a tiny little hole that the air can go through, but coolant doesn't go through. But when it warms up, suddenly the coolant goes back to the radiator. And so what we need to do today, I need better access here to get at the valve covers. And so I'm going to undo this bolt, and I'm going to push this hose out of the way and see if I can give myself more room. This is 8mm. This one is 6mm. Ooh, that's surprisingly loose. Okay, let's undo this one here. It's also 6mm, not very tight. Okay, now before we go to the other side, I'm going to undo this connector right here. This is the air suction valve. If your bike still has it, a lot of guys take it off for some reason. And I want to show you how it works. This is a vacuum line and it controls the valve. It's a spring-loaded valve. During situations of high vacuum, when there's a lot of vacuum here, this valve is shut and it won't allow the air suction valve to operate. This goes to the air intake, not the intake manifold, but the air intake. It's fresh, clean air, and it goes out to the two exhaust ports here. Not to the intake or to the manifold of the cylinder. It's not an EGR valve. It goes to the exhaust. And there's no pump involved. And so what it effectively does is it gives a small pulse of fresh, clean air into the exhaust pipes for better combustion of carbon monoxide and NOx fumes. It has no effect on performance at all. If you have a problem with your valve, then most of the time it's related to some kind of a vacuum leak. And that's a separate issue, but the valve itself should have no effect on performance. But in any case, the reason I'm undoing this now is that it's easier to undo this side of the connector than it is the other side, and I'll take you over there now. This is a tube we took off a moment ago, and this is an air breather tube for the engine. Take that off now. And this is just a drain to drain off any oil or contaminants that might get in through the air breather tube. Okay, and there's that. Okay, now let's do our spark plugs. First is the boot on the front. It's wise to blow some air in this before you put the plug in, because you don't want anything going into the cylinder. All right, now let's do the front plug. Now you see a lot of people complaining about this because the access isn't that great. This is one of my favorites. It's nice and magnetic. It doesn't work here, but inside the Kawasaki repair manual is a little plug that's specifically designed for this, and just pops in. And this is a 14mm. So we'll just pull this off now. It looks like the rear is going to be even more tricky. I pulled off the panel here to see if I can get more room on the spark plug wire, and there's not much more room, but anyway, we'll see if I can do this here. Boot came off easily enough. Okay. Yeah, let's see down there. I don't know if you can see it. Looks nice and clean and dry, no oil. The ideal gap is 0.7 to 0.8 millimeters, and these two both look perfect. These are the plugs I'm using. They're iridium, but otherwise identical to the NGKs. Now, one thing I should point out is that a lot of motorcycles and lawnmowers require you to remove this little end bobbin here. this little device here. And so you need to buy a spark plug where you can remove it, because if you have the stock ignition wires, they won't fit onto this big bobbin like they do with a regular engine. Okay, dealer's manual calls for 13 foot-pounds, and the NGK say to use finger tight and then half a turn. Of course, you can't get a torque wrench in here very easily. So we're going to split the difference. 13 foot-pounds is not very tight. Good enough. There's our air suction valve. Okay, I've blown it all clear of dirt. I've wiped it down. So now let's take the valve covers off. These are 10 millimeter, 3 of them.